Hello everybody and welcome back to the wild world of modular synthesis. Today we'll be learning about sequencers. So we can see here I've got this basic setup, just an oscillator hooked up to an amplifier controlled by an ADSR, going to the VCA mix, which is just pretty much 4 VCAs mixed into one channel, and then that all goes out to the audio. And right now it's not making any noise, but if it was, it would sound like that, which is pretty boring. Now let's say that we want to make a simple arpeggiator, but we don't want to have to hit the notes ourselves. We would like the synth to do that for us. Well, that's where a sequencer comes in. And there's all kinds of sequencers. You got some weird sequencers from Vox Glitch. You got some standard sequencers from Count Modula, like a 16-step sequencer, an 8-step sequencer. You got an even weirder sequencer from Count Modula, the binary sequencer. A nibble octet 64-step sequencer for your big patches. And then you got some trigger sequencers as well. So to make an arpeggiator like we're wanting, we'll just use an 8-step sequencer. Now what this module does is go through these rows one by one in some order. By default it's forward, but you could set it to a couple of different modes, but we'll leave it at forward for now. It goes through some number of these rows set by the length knob or by the length control voltage, and it will either output the gate, the trigger, or whatever the voltage is controlled by these knobs, or the inverted voltage. So if we have some kind of clock that's just pulsing at 120 beats per minute, we can put that in the clock input here, and we'll see this red light go down the rows. Now we don't want to get too crazy with our chords, so we'll just say that it has a length of 4. Alright, so now we can see this red dot only goes down the first 4 rows. And we can uncheck these, and we can check these. And with these checked, we can see that the gate light is on whenever the red light is on a row with a checked gate. And we'll leave the triggers on. And because it's so quickly, you can't really see the trigger light turning on, but it is. If we pull out a scope here, and we take the trigger, put it in, we can see it's got this there. We can see the triggers happening every so often. So we can use these with something we learned last time, the voltage controlled amplifier and the ADSR, to only play a note at certain times. Now, because of how short the trigger is, we won't get up to our attack. Our attack takes 10 milliseconds, and the trigger is much shorter than that. So we can use something called a gate modifier. And what this does is take in a trigger and turn that into a gate. So the trigger input of the gate modifier takes the trigger And the modified gate output is what will output that trigger in gate form. So if we pull the scope out again, let's connect the input of the scope to the trigger, and the second input of the scope to the modified gate output. And we up the length here to 0.25. Now on the scope, we can see when the trigger happens, it goes up and down immediately, but this purple line represents the gate. So we can see that stays on for a little bit longer, 0.25 seconds to be precise, I think. Maybe not exactly. No, actually, I think it is 0.25 seconds. Either way, we don't have to be too precise. So if we hook up this modified gate output to the gate input of the ADSR, we get more of what we were expecting. So we'll turn that level down a bit. And this is kind of boring. It's just the same note repeating over and over. So what if we take what we learned last time and we connect maybe the control voltage output of the sequencer to the pitch input of the oscillator? Nothing happens. Well, that's because we haven't modified these knobs. But if we were to turn these up a little bit, we can hear and that is an arpeggiator. It sounds pretty out of tune, but it could be considered an arpeggiator. So we'll use a module called the quantizer, which will just take voltages and round them to the nearest nice note, the nearest note on a piano. So if we take the output from the sequencer into the pitch input of the quantizer, and then we take the pitch output of the quantizer into the pitch input of the oscillator. Wow. Much nicer. And I'm actually pretty surprised that I got a C major 7th chord without having to do any adjustments. Usually you have to adjust. Like for example, we'll change that to 1 volt, and that'll just be a C major arpeggio going up. And we can make it go faster if we want, or slower by changing the clock. And so that's how to use a sequencer like this. But of course, there are all kinds of ways that you can change it. For example, the direction. We could say pendulum. That way it'll go up and then back down. Or reverse, which just goes in reverse, as you can see by the red light right here. You could say just choose a random one, and then it'll choose a random row. Forward 1 shot. Not really sure what that does. Pendulum 1 shot, reverse 1 shot, random 1 shot, voltage addressed. I think that probably has to do with the run input. And whenever you give that a high voltage, it'll go up once. So one of the good things to do in modular synthesis is to just try things out And so we'll do that using this module called the manual gate. That will give us a gate based on when we press the button. So if we hook that up to the run input, maybe the gate output. Nope. Sometimes they are tricky. Yeah, well, this is a good time to also point out that there are manuals for these modules. So if you don't know how to work one, right-click on it, and if you go to Info, User Manual, and so that'll bring you to where you can look at all the instructions on how to use these modules. So let's go ahead and put that back to forward. And now we've got a pretty little arpeggio. Now, if we, for example, wanted to bring back some control, we could get a MIDI to CV, and then use another important module, the mix module, which just takes up to 6 voltages and adds them. We could mix the quantizer's output with the MIDI CV pitch output and put that all into the voltage controlled oscillator. And this would allow us to change which key the major chord is in. So right now it's in C, but if I were to hit the D key on a piano or a keyboard, that would bring the kind of the bass up. So let's look at that in a scope. So we'll put the mix output into the scope. And there we can see. Now if I select C again, we can see that this yellow line goes down to the center. If I would hit G, we can see that its bass line is now up here. So you could use this basic setup and extend it to make a chord bank somehow. So you could get a couple of these sequencers, give them different values, like for example a minor chord. You could make another sequencer that has a minor chord and somehow switch between those two and press keys on your keyboard to change which chord you're playing. So that's a pretty good exercise. It would involve another important module called a switch. So there are all kinds of switches. There's the 2 switch, the 1 to 8, the 1 to 16, the 8 to 1, the 16 to 1. And all they do is just allow you to choose from n number of inputs to 1 output, or 1 input either going to 16 different outputs. So for example, to do the chord bank, we could say use an 8 to 1 switch. And of course course, we would need to duplicate these 3 modules, and we'll put them down here. And we'll bring that back up to a major chord. And we'll hook up we'll stop that so that it's not going in the background. We'll hook these each up to the clock so that they are playing at the same time. And we'll say that the major chord, its mixed output, goes to input 1 of the switch. Oh, I want to make sure to hook up both of these to the pitch from the MIDI. And then we'll say that the minor chord goes to input 2 of the switch. Now if we get another one of those manual gates and we put it here, hook up the trigger output of the manual gate to the clock input of the 8-to-1 switch. Whenever we press the gate button, we can see that red light move down. Now, since we only have these 2 inputs, we'll set the length to be 2, and we'll set the direction, leave that as forward. So now whenever we click this gate button, it'll switch from taking the major chord input to taking the minor chord input, and back to the major chord when we hit it again. So if we have this output hooked up to the voltage controlled oscillator's pitch input, what goes here will depend on where this red dot is, and where this red dot is depends on us clicking this gate. So let's hook up the gate back to the ADSR. Alright. So that's pretty nice. Now if we hit the gate, we can see that that switches to a C minor. If we hit it again, back to a major. So it's switching between these 2. And you could do this with all kinds of chords. You could do 7th chords, diminished chords, seconds, 4th, all kinds. You would just need to add more steps to the sequencer, increase the length, stuff like that. Let's put this up to 240 and change this to 0.125. Yeah. Alright. So if you wanted, you could, let's see, D, E, F, yeah. So for example, a simple chord progression could be done like this. And of course, it would just go on. Now, I'm just gonna say this to hammer home the big point of modular synthesis. What we just did there with that chord progression, manually pressing keys on the keyboard and clicking this manual gate at certain times, that can be automated. So we'll finish this video off by doing that. And to do that, we'll introduce another important module called the voltage-controlled pulse divider. Now this will basically count some number of pulses, and then every, let's say 16, it'll either output the first pulse or the 16th pulse. And we can use that with another sequencer and another quantizer to do what we were just doing without the MIDI and without the manual gate. So if we hook up the output 1 to the clock of this sequencer, and then we hook up, let's see, the gate here, or we'll say the trigger here, to the, let's see, so what we were doing before with the manual gate was switching here, so we'll say that the trigger output of this sequencer goes to switch 8-1, and we'll also say that these knobs will kind of emulate what we were doing manually with our keyboard. So I was just going from D to E to F back to E. So if we say that the output here goes to the pitch input here, yep, so the first red light corresponds to that D, second red light corresponds to the E, third red light corresponds to the F, and then the fourth red light corresponds back to the E. And with some of this, you just have to get the timing right. But now we should have what we need once we hook up this pitch output to the mix, just like we were doing with the MIDI that we were manually pressing. And now it might be a little bit off, but we'll fix that if we hook up the modified gate output to the ADSR. No, yeah, it works. Now, sometimes your sequencers will be out of, oh, yep, just like that. They'll be out of sync a little bit. Or maybe you messed up and you said one trigger would be on when it shouldn't be, and that's fine. We'll just turn that off. But yeah, sometimes they'll be out of sync. Like maybe this sequencer will be on its 1 pulse when this one is on 3. That's what this reset input is for. That will put them back to just 0 pretty much, so that next time the clock pulses, they'll be set to 1. So I guess in that case, since our first chord is minor, we would technically want to switch these. And if we use the master reset, this lets us just have a gate that we can use to reset sequencers and other things. So if we hook all that up, in the case that one of them gets out of order, for example, like you can hear that it's not quite right. They're out of sync now. If we just hit reset, watch these red lights carefully. There we go. Not quite, but the world of modular synths is rarely right on the first try. So since those were swapped, it got a little confused. But I think it's back to being right. Yeah. So anyways, that's how to make a very simple chord arpeggiator. Just a little backing track. Using sequencers and switches. If we wanted this to be quicker, we could say divide by 4. And we can see it's not quite how we want it to be. So, if we hit reset, there we go. It just takes a little bit of finessing and debugging. But now we've got a nice synthesizer like that. And of course, if we bring in what we learned from the very start, and we make a little synthesizer here, we can have a nice Song of Storms jam. Put the V-oct in there. Alright. Ah, yes. Computer. Yeah, so we can get the computer to play our backing chords for us pretty easily with the sequencer and the switch. And this is pretty extensible as well. So, for example, if you wanted to do a different song, you would just change these knobs, change this quantizer, and switch when the triggers happen to switch between minor and major chords. So yeah, today we mainly learned about sequencers and switches, things that let you go from one input to the next in different ways. And next time we'll probably learn about some effects and ways to actually make the sounds sound a bit better or more different than just a basic sine wave like this. So yeah, hope you enjoyed, hope you learned something, and tune in next time.